Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Beyond Innovation. I'm here again with my colleague, Lynn Rakowsky.
Happy to be here yet again.
Thank you for coming. Today, we're going to dig into part 2 of our two-part series around storytelling. We started with storytelling to investors to raise money. We're going to shift gears and talk about storytelling to potential customers and partners. So let's get into it.
So there's a lot to cover when we're talking about storytelling to customers and partners, but today we're going to focus on 3 key areas that really set the foundation for what you need to do. And that, well, first of all, what do we mean about storytelling in this space? It's not bedtime stories, just as a hint.
Right.
How do we understand the key personas and what and how we need to tailor accordingly? And then also, where are we going to tell this story?
Yeah, those are all key pieces of the puzzle to understand storytelling.
Yeah. So why don't you just kick us off with what we mean by storytelling?
I'm going to start with what we don't mean by storytelling.
It's a good place to start.
So what we don't mean by storytelling is, hi, I'm Bob. My daughter, Sarah, likes to listen to music. I'm the dad, blah, 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 blah. We're not talking about bedtime stories. We're not talking about long narratives. We're talking about using storytelling as a means to drive the outcome versus explain the solution. Mm-hmm. Right. So I'll give a very basic example. If you're going to buy a cell phone, and on the back of that phone there is a camera, or 2 or 3 now, there is one way to tell the story that says, this is the megapixels of the camera, 48 megapixels. This is the optical zoom is 10x. The dynamic range is X to Y. The number of colors that this can handle is 6 million colors. The frame rate that it can capture video at is 60 frames a second, 120 frames a second. And you can explain all those, and imagine you take a picture of the camera. On the back of the camera, you have a bunch of leaders, and you say, this is all the things that the camera does. Or you take a beautiful photo, and you tell everyone it was captured with that camera. Now, the lay person can see the photo and say, oh, wow, I get to take beautiful photos with that because that camera took that picture. The technically competent person looks at the photo and says, wow, that is able to capture great black point, excellent bright whites, full contrast, beautiful depth of field, all captured from a phone. Well, I would have thought that was captured from a DSLR or some other camera. Mm-hmm. So you're able to bridge between technical gaps because the way you articulate the story has stuff for both audiences. But you aren't just listing specifications for someone to then have to digest. So that's a very basic demonstration of 2 ways to tell a story.
Yeah. And there may come a point in your conversation, your long conversation with your customer, you might start talking tech specs.
Definitely.
But definitely not up front.
Not up front.
Outcome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I think one of the key pieces that should be clarified here at the beginning is our storytelling space, the space that we spend a lot of time in, is very oftentimes in this B2B technology space, mm-hmm. which is much harder. Let's be clear. It is much harder to weave in storytelling when you're talking about technical solutions than it is when you're talking about a phone, because you don't get the benefit of lifestyle.
Yeah.
Lifestyle does so much for consumer brands because they can do things like, if you drink this beer, you're probably going to sit around a campfire with a bunch of very good looking friends and have an amazing time, right?
Yeah.
And so the beer is irrelevant, right? The beer doesn't even have to taste good because the lifestyle that the beer brings you is why you're with the beer brand. That's harder to do when you're selling business intelligence software, you're selling efficiency software, you're selling stuff into the manufacturing space or into the geolocation space. So sometimes we get a little lost in like, well, look what Apple does. It's like, well, okay, they can lean on lifestyle in a way that most technology companies don't have that opportunity.
Yeah,
you can do it,
not.
but you're doing it in a really, really different way, and it's a lot harder. It's a lot more nuanced.
Yeah. So I think, how do we then take it's okay? So we've established this is outcome driven.
Mm-hmm.
There's some pretty typical personas that you have within the B2B space, each requiring a different outcome
Mm-hmm.
within a same story,
Mm-hmm.
sort of. How would you go about that? How do you define that?
So in the way that we do this for our customers, so if you reflect back to the last episode, we talked about audience being critical on the fundraising side, because audience drives the way you tell your story. Yeah. The same rules apply, but instead of thinking about these in audiences, you can think about them in more generic personas, so more almost job driven versus audience driven. And so within the persona set, you have this really, specifically in the B2B side, you oftentimes have this layered group of people that you're talking to. You have the person who's the purchaser, someone who's going to buy the stuff from you, that has a different set of needs than the person who's going to then manage the application that you deliver, than the person who's going to use the application. Now, the larger the organization, the further those people are apart. In some cases, they don't even know each other. In other cases, maybe they're all in the same office or in the same facility. And in smaller organizations, those might even be the same person. The same person buys it that uses it when you're working with a smaller company. So you have to really clearly at the beginning define your customer segment has the following personas that break up something like that. And for the most part, they're going to layer in that way. You've got an executive who's interested in something, a buyer who's interested in something else, a manager in the third thing, and a user in something different. And there's obvious overlap between them, but they have very clear distinctions about what's going to get them excited.
How do you define those distinctions, like in general?
So the distinctions get defined mostly by the outcomes that you're trying to drive from each of those different user groups. So let's put some specificity to these examples. So let's just say we're building software that drives efficiency we do a lot of work in the manufacturing sector, so it's an easy one for me to use. In the manufacturing sector, everything is all about efficiency. So you're going to build a piece of software that's going to drive efficiency. So efficiency is like your top value prop. Everybody wants efficiency in your entire user chain. But if you're talking about the buyer, well, what does efficiency mean to a buyer? Efficiency to a buyer means financial efficiency, ease of implementation, ease of security, ease of deployment across the organization. That's efficiency. Now you think about a manager. Well, a manager is going to think about, okay, they are also probably financially driven, but now they're thinking about efficiency of people. How do I ensure that my people can be onboarded easily? How do I ensure that I have low risk to how I go about deploying this across the organization? How do I limit errors in the work that people are doing? How do I maintain visibility both up and down through the organization? So it's still efficiency, but it's different pieces of efficiency that get them excited. Then let's go down one more layer and say, okay, now what about the user? Well, the user's more interested in things like ease of use, ability to multitask, ability to understand and tune a workflow. If you use the word workflow as you're trying to demonstrate efficiency to the buyer you're gonna lose them right away, because oftentimes they don't even know what the workflow is. What's a good workflow or a bad workflow? They have no way to sort of determine that value difference. Whereas if you just talk about financial gain to a user, well, they're going to be interested in that because their bonus is probably somehow tied to performance of the organization, but it's lower on the list for them. It's lower on the things that they're excited about. So you have to just be cognizant of the fact that the various personas that you're trying to convince that you have a good idea all have different hooks that you need to put into them so that they keep listening, keep learning, and eventually come and buy.
And I think one of the key points is that there is always an overarching value proposition that you got to figure out how to weave into each of these different segments or these different personas. Know what your proof points are for each of them, because they will be different. And then really be crystal clear on how you deliver it to each of those personas.
200%. I mean, if you think about the first example we gave, you have to figure out what's the photo you're showing.
Yeah.
Because it's a different photo. I'm using that as a metaphor, but it's a different photo to the person who's buying it than it is for the person who's using it. Because they're looking at the software or the hardware or the technology solution from a completely different point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So you taking the time early on to say, who is the person that I'm talking to? What about their job can I improve by giving them the solution that I give them? Using, as you described, like this overarching value proposition, you should know that. Like if you don't know that part going in, you cannot tell your story.
Yeah.
If you know that what you're delivering is an efficiency story, an integration story, a financial improvement story, that is the you hear this term of either the red thread or the North Star of the brand.
Mm-hmm.
That's got to be everywhere. I'm going to just pick on one little point with this while we're in this topic.
Okay.
Remember where we come from. We come from the design, development, and deployment of revenue generating solutions, and then we get hired to wrap a story around them. I'm just going to say that a lot of the time I can see when a marketing firm and or person wrote a headline with limited understanding for what the actual solution does. Because you can see how generic it gets really quickly. And you can see that it isn't directly connected to whatever the solution is in a way that makes it much harder for the user or the buyer or one of these personas to see themselves in the headline. Yeah. If you use a term like efficiency, again, I'll come back to the efficiency story, in a manufacturing setting, every single person who works in a manufacturing facility is interested in efficiency. If you decouple those two things and you try to be super aspirational with the way you tell your story, there's a guy in our office who likes to use the term word salad. Mm-hmm. It's like you just took all the jargon words that are close to the category you're working in, you put them in a bowl, you shook them up, and then you threw them on the page and you said, we are the synergistic dot connecting
efficiency.
Yeah. Disruptor.
Yeah.
You say nothing
with
to
AI.
No one. With AI. Well, you say nothing to no one. Yeah. So that layer's hard. That's a hard thing to articulate. If you don't have that and it's not really good, these next pieces, they never come together because you don't have that thing you can point back. Yeah. Everybody should be pointing back at that one thing. So
I think it's interesting. You see a lot of examples where people get, right, it's this balance between aspiration and technology. And so often you see companies lean really heavy in the aspiration. And so they've lost that connection, as you just mentioned, to what it is they actually do. Or you see them so deeply involved in explaining their technology mm-hmm. because it's their baby. Yeah. It's what they know. It's mm-hmm. really exciting to them. Mm-hmm. They lose that ability to connect from okay, what the heck does that actually mean? And why is that good for me?
Yeah. And it's a really good point because some of what drives that is the fact that the people who build the solutions, especially in this technology space, that's
startup space, especially
very popular.
Yeah.
Well, in our office, it's very popular. The people who build the solutions are not a customer. Mm-hmm. So they tell the story from the point of view of the people who would build it, not the people who would buy it. And getting you decoupled from your own bias about your own knowledge. And we had this conversation yesterday. It was not a technology story, but we had a conversation yesterday with a guy who's deeply passionate about the product that he's building. And it was very evident that he was going to have an extremely difficult time separating his knowledge base and his passion from his audience's knowledge base and passion.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And especially in startups, I think this is probably hardest in startups because the founders are oftentimes early days trying to tell their own story, which is how you get going. But it happens also in large corporations where the team that builds it falls in love with the thing they made. They don't fall in love with the problem that they solve. And therefore, it's really hard for them to articulate the outcome that they're trying to drive for their customer.
Yeah.
So that takes a lot of practice. And sometimes people get a little wrapped around the axle with the details and sort of forget that the whole point of any of this is to get someone who doesn't already know what they want to see right away that they fit with the outcome that you're driving. That I didn't even quite process that that's a problem that I have and that this could solve that problem. I was coming here for this reason mostly, and now I see like all these other reasons why I'm here. So I think that's when you've really landed in a good spot where people can just instantly understand that's why I'm here.
Yeah. So I want to take us to where we're actually going to start telling these stories.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of spaces in today's world where stories can be told.
Probably too
So we're
many.
not going to talk about all of them, but we're going to focus on two really big ones, which is in a digital space, let's say focused on websites, because that's, kind of got to have a website, but how do you want to use it now? And then also in-person experiences, but specifically in more of a trade show environment or something like that.
A sales environment.
A large
trade show
environment. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I think let's start on the digital side.
Okay.
10 years ago, your website was treated differently than it was 5 years ago, is treated differently than it is today. Today, we have, I'm going to say 6 to 10 digital channels to find information. We have lots of very short form places where we can find information. So if you think LinkedIn, where this will get broadcast in some small piece, that is a short form delivery of information. Instagram, short form delivery of information. X is even shorter. Mm-hmm. If your brand is viable in TikTok, it's short form. YouTube then gets us long form and short form, but mostly long form. But it is, it's passive. It is long form, passive delivery of information. Your website is this place where you get to blend all of these things together. And your goal is to keep somebody engaged and interested for as long as possible, to drive them to the call to action, to get them to do the next thing that you want them to do. Which means you have to think of the web side, the website side of this very similarly to the way you think about a trade show environment, which you have a very noisy place, which is the internet. You have to manage the way they travel through your website so that you walk them down the golden path so that they do the next thing you want them to do, whether that's book a demo, whether that's reach out directly, or whether that's buy. In some cases, that's just click buy.
Yep.
So knowing at the beginning, not only who the persona is, what's going to get them excited, but what's the action you want from them is critical to deciding how you display this information. So the website piece of this puzzle ends up looking a little more like a tree than a funnel. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the sales funnel, which we sort of, you can draw very simply. We want to capture as many people as we can at the beginning. We want to give them high level information. Then we want to start to distill this down until we get them to buy. That is the marketing funnel. When you get into the website, you're going to take people in with something that is exciting, something that is enthusiastic, something that tells a story that they want to know more about. And then you need to immediately move them into a place where they are now learning why, not what, but why what you're delivering is the ideal solution for them.
Yep.
And then you're moving them and you're trying to figure out, are they a manager? Are they a buyer? Are they a user? And you're just building this upside down tree, really. It's like roots in the ground where you're flowing them into these places where all they can do is act. And they're going to act in the way that you want them to act. Book, contact, reach out. Schedule, whatever it is.
Yep.
And that mapping exercise, if you do that at the very earliest stages, then your content kind of just flows as a result of it. And your storytelling goes from pretty high level, somewhat aspirational, and it gets more and more granular. But in each case, if you keep outcomes as your key topic, you never get lost in this box ticking feature world that I'm going to say most technology companies land in. At some point there's this, the grid, it makes me wacko. The grid of like our technology, our competitors' technology, and then a list of features and then check boxes. Yeah. It's like the most pedestrian, least impactful way to get some, like, does anybody ever remember what box was ticked in the grid?
Not typically.
Never.
It's typically they do more.
Oh yeah. You have more boxes ticked than your competitor, so you must be better. So yeah, that's kind of how we look at the digital side, is we really try to map the way that people are going to flow through it, align those to the personas that we want to target, and then make sure that the way we're driving them through lands in an action that has the business outcome that everyone is after.
Yeah. Now, the place where technical B2B storytelling can actually get really exciting.
Yes.
Is when you start to move into these in-person experiences.
100%.
And there's a couple of reasons. One, it's not necessarily a well-traveled space where people do a lot of interesting things. So the bar might be a little bit lower, for example, in manufacturing versus like other spaces.
Mm-hmm. Health technology. I was just at Vive and it was a snooze fest. It was unbelievable. The most interesting space in Snooze Fest, Vive, was, sorry, but it was it was a snooze fest. It was so uninteresting, and there's so much interesting technology there, and it was so benign. There was very little enthusiasm. The most interesting space that I saw was a golf simulator. It had a huge crowd around it. Huge. Had nothing to do with the technology they were talking about. It just got people excited, got people to go over there.
Because it broke the boredom up. So I think this is that's a great example to sort of launch into. How do you change your brand, your narrative?
Yeah.
Where I'm maybe I'm pulling things like that to draw people in, but why?
Right.
I
think a golf simulator is a funny one because it's so decoupled from the brand and the idea that it was a little bit of a throwaway. It worked. Let me just say that it worked. But there's ways to do this where it's more aligned.
Yeah. And maybe more crowd pleasing. I think that's a certain element of
100%.
Crowd.
Yeah. This was a little strange. It worked. So let's just talk about in-person experiences as a philosophical rule. If you just assume the following rules, these are generally speaking accurate, regardless of whether you have a card table and you're one person with a little trifold or a major corporation with a gigantic space. The first impression is a passive impression. Someone is walking by and they are going to look left, look right, and they're going to decide, is this worth me spending any more time here? You have 3 to 10 seconds to get them to look up and go, oh, that's cool. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. So the first layer, what we call it the big wow. The thing that now big wow doesn't need to be big and it doesn't need to be expensive, but it has to be something that is unexpected, engaging, and get someone to stop long enough to learn the next thing. So if you think about it, just like the website, we need them to want to know more.
And in this environment, is this typically more of a visual
Oftentimes.
draw versus a yeah.
Oftentimes. It doesn't always have to be a visual draw, but oftentimes it's a visual
Sure.
draw. So once you've captured their attention, you've gotten them to pause, look, and think like, oh, this is very interesting. Now they're going to take a literal step closer and an information step closer. The next step closer is something to inspire them to want to use the stuff you're giving them. That does not mean they should get a demo of the software right there or get a demo of the way the hardware works in situ. That means this is where I think you can have the most fun. So you can be playful, you can be unexpected, you can be very, you can be loud. And your goal is to hold their attention so that they start to literally experiment with whatever it is that you're giving them in whatever means that is rational or relevant to your solution. And then the third layer is when you start to actually sell to them. And if you flow them through, by the time they get to that third layer, they're interested, they are by default engaged, and they've already learned a little bit about what you're doing, and they're coming in semi-educated about how that might apply to them. And now your job kicks into, okay, how do I sell them stuff? I'm going to give a really abstract example because we're in this room and I'm reminded of it. About 6 years ago, we got hired by an acoustic panel company, B2B. They make felted material, like the most basic thing in an office space, just felted material, and its whole job is acoustics, sound. Mm-hmm. It took us a little while, but we pitched to them this idea that don't do a trade show where you show like tiles of all your stuff and all the colors and the catalog you can go through. Let's create an entire space, floor, walls, objects, ceiling, all out of your material. So you were literally walking on it. So when you walk by, it had this very bold presence mostly because the floor became the wall, became the ceiling, all the same material. And then we had these weird sculptures made out of this felted material that were just objects. We just literally hand built them. And the inspiration piece is what happened next. So as you're walking down the hallway, you look at it and you're like, oh, that's weird. And then as soon as you stepped in, the world of the trade show left and it went silent.
Amazing.
Because the room is an acoustic room, acoustic absorption room. We didn't have to say a word. We didn't say this absorbs sound. We didn't say it absorbs sound at this percentage. We didn't say it has these acoustic properties. You walked in and boom, it was like deafeningly silent. They didn't even have music playing. They just wanted it silent. And then you learned what colors it came in and how you could print on it and where it went and how much it cost. That's that flow that we're talking about. You don't have to say it all the time. Just let them experience it. And it's infinitely, anybody who walked into that space will remember the silence more than they'd ever remember the decibel drop of the material when compared against drywall.
Right.
Like it's totally immemorable statistics. But that silence is memorable. The visual is memorable. And then you walk out with the information that you need. So that's the way we like to think about building experiences in person. And if you're at a table and you're by yourself, you can do the same thing. This isn't just for big companies. Like the company we did it for wasn't a huge company. That booth, by the way, won Best in Show at NeoCon 2019. You can do this in small ways. You can do this with visual content that is unexpected. You can do this with interactive content that is unexpected, like having something there for someone to play with where they don't have to talk to you. They're just able to play with it a little bit and go, oh, this is kind of cool. And then they'll talk to you. Is an easy way to like break that little barrier between the audience and the technology you're trying to deliver.
But it's also super foundational in how humans learn, right? I mean, this isn't a new thing. Like from a very early age, we learn by experiencing something,
Yeah.
by playing, by touching, by seeing, by smelling, whatever it is. So
That's a good point.
this is all about driving all the senses and thinking about how humans learn in general.
Yeah.
And how do you leap them there quicker is to get them to experience, touch, feel.
That is a very good point. I think we can close this on this idea. I'm going to close on a stat, which is funny, but humans are 22 times more likely to remember a story than they are a statistic.
Absolutely.
So if you do this through storytelling, I'm using air quotes on the audio side, you build a more locked in memory of whatever the thing is that you're trying to talk about. So that's why we're talking about doing it this way.
So I think that stat is super interesting, that you're 22% more likely to remember a story than
22 times.
22 times.
Not 22%.
So that alone, like we
Yeah.
could just stop with there. But
Yeah.
if you take a look at what we talked about today, which was what do we mean by it? Like, and that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding who those personas are and what value proposition do they even give a hoot about?
Mm-hmm.
And then now we get into the fun part. Now I can actually tell the story. Where am I telling this story? And how am I creating it? And how am I pulling them through, whether it's through a digital experience on the web or this in-person experience where it can get super fun and
Mm-hmm.
dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
I hope this has given people some food for thought.
Me too. That was fun.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.